Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hannah Zuberi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. You can watch us on Muslim Network TV 24/7 on Samsung Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and soon Apple TV. So today we're here to discuss the Palestinian Day of Rage. With Netanyahu seeking to reveal his scheme to unilaterally annex parts of the West Bank this week, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict faces far much more than it ever has. The Israeli government has suggested that plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank could be revealed starting today, July 1st. Today joining me are two wonderful young activists from American Muslims for Palestine. We have Mohamed Habehh. Mohamed is a Palestinian American community organizer. He's a graduate from Rutgers University with a degree in social work and political science. He currently serves as the National Development Coordinator for American Muslims for Palestine. And also joining us today is Nathan Feldman. Nathan is an activist with Freedom to Boycott in Maryland, a statewide organization dedicated to Palestinian solidarity and fighting state and national level attacks on the First Amendment right to boycott Israel. He has written op-eds promoting Palestinian human rights for the Baltimore Sun and the Diamondback. Thank you so much, Nathan and Mohamed, for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Great to talk.
So, Mohamed, I'd like to start with you. Give us some background on, yourself, your activism, and then we're going to talk about what brings you to the Palestinian Day of Rage.
So, as you stated before, I'm a Palestinian American, born and raised here, who has always felt it's important for me as a Palestinian to advocate for my family back home and my people around the world. In addition to that, growing up as a young person in this country, as a minority, you learn it's important to advocate for everyone. So I've been involved in different organizations around the country that have advocated for people with special abilities, advocated for incarcerated individuals, and advocated for minority youth who live in underprivileged communities. I've been working with American Muslims for Palestine for a couple years now, and before that, even volunteered with them at a local level. So I've been doing this work for a while, and I think it's important to make sure that we keep standing up for our people, no matter what the cause is, because we're all in this together.
I'm sorry. Nathan, could you share a little bit about your background and what has brought you into advocating for Palestine?
Absolutely. So those who know me know that I'm a Jewish American activist, and my Hebrew name, Naphtali, comes from my great-grandfather, Naphtali Friedman, who came over to Canada from Eastern Europe back in the 1930s. And our family found out at his funeral that he had actually helped bring over several other Jewish Europeans at the time of the Holocaust and help them immigrate illegally into Canada by matching them up with sponsors with similar sounding last names. And so the lessons that I learned from that experience and from Jewish history more broadly, from Moses up until the present day, show that it is necessary today, in the spirit of Tikkun Olam, repair the world, to have solidarity with Palestinians, solidarity with everybody, solidarity with refugees, and to oppose nationalist and militarist ideologies that put both Jews and everybody else, and today Palestinians, in danger and wipe out national identity.
So both of you have been, did you guys start with your activism in college or before that? So I'd like to ask Mohamed first and then Mohamed.
So I like to always say that as a Palestinian, you're born as an activist. From a young age, you're raised understanding the different oppressions going on to your people and people who follow the same faith as you around the world. So as a kid, I remember going to rallies for Palestine, speaking out for the people of Kashmir, speaking out for other Muslim groups around the country, around the world, and around the country. And in addition to that, just because you feel that the importance to stand up for oppressed people who follow your faith, who are of the same background as you also find the importance of standing up for people around the world, no matter what their cause is, as long as they're being oppressed. I proudly stand with people who are oppressed around the world.
Nathan, where did your awakening happen or your activism start?
I, in college, began to focus in on a more broad array of progressive causes than I had ever been paying attention to in high school or earlier, where freshman year of college, I went on Birthright and found that some of the speeches that we were being given from the Israeli officials on the trip seemed to be somewhat questionable in terms of some of the latent racism that I was encountering. And so after my Birthright trip, I started to expose myself to Palestinian activists, first online, then through the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter.
Can you? I'm gonna interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
Many of our audience may not know what a Birthright trip is.
Oh yeah, so Birthright is a trip sponsored by Sheldon Adelson and some far-right Jewish philanthropists in the United States and the Israeli government to give Jewish youth a free trip to Israel. And as you can see from the name Birthright, it's somewhat, shall we say, colonialist to think that a Jewish American with very little connection to the land should be given a free trip whenever they want in their youth, and a Palestinian should be given permanent exile. And so as I began to ask questions to myself and talk to some of the most patient activists I've ever met from the Students for Justice in Palestine, I saw that what's going on with the occupation is such a clear violation of basic dignity that I just had to get involved, because at the end of the day, I'm implicated personally, having been a participant and having these organizations that claim to represent my voice for the Palestinian people's oppression.
So Mohamed, tell us more about the Day of Rage.
So the Day of Rage is today a full day of protests going on around the world in response to the latest act of settler colonialism and the annexation that Israel had promised to kick off today. People around the world, including Palestine, Jordan, and other countries in the Middle East, have been gathering and protesting this blatant act of war crimes that Israel is threatening to commit at the moment. So we're seeing people around the world, especially in the Middle East, coming out and speaking out against this. Historically, Day of Rages have always been the people's and the grassroots answer to Israeli aggression to the Palestinian people. And today around the world, including here in Washington, D.C., in cities around the country, here in America, people are gathering in the streets and saying that they will not accept this blatant act of aggression towards the Palestinian people.
Now, for our viewers who may not know, let's talk about this most recent annexation plan for a moment. Today, Netanyahu plans to annex large stretches of the West Bank. This is on the top of Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank that violate international law. So what exactly does Israel want in regards to further annexation of Palestinian land?
So it's no surprise Israel is a country that began by land theft. Stealing land from the Palestinian people. In 1948, they took over 78% of the land of historic Palestine. And then in 1967, they took control over all of Palestine and stole land from some neighboring countries as well. In this annexation plan, this is something that was initially started out as the Prime Minister Netanyahu saying a campaign promise saying that he wanted to annex land from the West Bank to gain more right-wing support. And then earlier this year, when Donald Trump announced the deal of the century, or as many Palestinians call it, the steal of the century, it allowed plans for Israel to take over 30% of the West Bank. Today was the announced day of the beginning of the annexation by the Israeli government. But as of now, it seems that Israel is taking a step back due to internal political issues, and they're going to be waiting this out a little bit and continuing possibly at a later date. Unfortunately, even if they do not begin annexation today, they have been stealing Palestinian land on a daily basis. These areas, part of the areas that they're saying that they wish to annex is already stolen land due to the illegal settlements that we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. So right now we're showing, courtesy of the Middle East Middle East Eye website, a map of currently what is Palestine and what is called parts of Israel. Nathan, do you want to walk us through this map?
Sure. So what we're looking at on this map is a map of the West Bank, which has been occupied and in some ways being annexed de facto for the past 50 years by Israel illegally in violation of UN Resolution 242. And what we see here on the map are three areas: Area B, Area C, and Area A, which represent varying degrees of Palestinian control, where throughout all of Area C, which was designated in the Oslo so-called peace accords, Israel has been expanding settlements for the past 50 years and essentially taking land that belongs to Palestine under its own control and under its own sovereignty for its own citizens. And so this has constituted the erasure of any kind of Palestinian national identity on top of the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948. And inherent in this occupation, we've been seeing the demolition of Palestinian homes, the increased control of Palestinian daily life, and constant racist incitement against Palestinian civilians by Israeli settlers in order to entrench this occupation and de facto annexation for the past 50 years. And so what we've been starting to see today is Israel moving to split the West Bank into three, take over land officially into its own borders that splits off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank and permanently destroys the chance for a sovereign Palestinian state without any kind of reshaping of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians.
So if you're in, can you, Mohamed, perhaps if you could also, can you tell us a little bit more about why West Bank is so important to Palestinians?
So the fact of the matter is the West Bank is important because that's where the majority of Palestinians were pushed out to. That was the original area of land that was not taken over during the initial ethnic cleansing in 1948. So in that period of time, the state of Israel stole about 78% of the land of historic Palestine. So the West Bank and Gaza are about 22% of historic Palestine's land. For the Palestinian people who live there, that's their homes. There are many refugee camps there as well. So many Palestinians have been pushed into the West Bank. It's the last pockets of land that are still technically under Palestinian ownership and control. But of course, in 1967, Israel was able to occupy the West Bank and occupy Gaza. So effectively, Israel controls all the land as we speak. And Palestinians are just fighting for whatever little rights they have to their own land left.
So when you're in West Bank, whose laws are you supposed to follow?
So it depends where in the West Bank, of course. So Area C is under full Israeli control. Area B is under technical partial Israeli control, and Area A is supposedly under the Palestinian Authority control. But of course, the control at the end of the day always goes back to the higher power, which is Israel. So no matter where you are in the West Bank, if you do something that Israel thinks isn't allowed or illegal under their laws, you will face repercussions from them.
Have you been to the West Bank, Nathan?
I was actually taken to the West Bank and some of the settlements when I went on my birthright trip, which is somewhat ironic given that Palestinians, especially Palestinian refugees, are not able to go, and that the West Bank is really the land that Palestinians are supposedly allowed to have left after Israel's increased taking over of Palestinian land. And when I went, it was presented to me as if the settlements were just your standard communities and that there was nothing wrong with their presence. But as I have come to learn, when you have an area that you're declaring to be a war zone, as Israel supposedly feels with its annexation and occupation, it makes no sense to set up civilian homes in the land unless it's an active attempt to take it over. And so the settlements have, as I found out, are a lot more malignant than I originally thought. And the Israeli government, in order to maintain control over them, has been committing the range of human rights abuses that I discussed earlier, home demolitions, detention of children, among others.
And let's talk about these terms, annexation, settlement. They seem very benign, right? We're just going in here and we're making a settlement. What does that actually look like for the people who were living there before, Mohamed?
So settlements are made by settlers from proper Israel, from historic Palestine, going into the West Bank and laying claim to land. Israeli settlers are typically much more right wing than your average Zionist and average Israeli. And they believe that they have a right to all of the land. In addition, when settlers come to the West Bank, they are still governed under Israeli civilian law. And typically the West Bank itself is governed by Israeli military law. So you see, even though they're living literally side by side, they are governed by different rules, and Palestinians are governed with the full might of the Israeli military. In addition, when settlers come into the occupied West Bank, they are able to, one, perpetuate this theft of resources. So there have been research projects and different stats that showed how Israeli settlers have been able to take Palestinian water when the average Palestinian may not be able to use water once a day or once a week sometimes. Israelis have pools in the settlement that's literally stolen land from their village. So when Israeli settlements are created, not only are they stealing land, but they're stealing the Palestinian resources as well, and they give the Israeli military more control in perpetuating their military occupation, and give the Israeli military more control over the Palestinian people in the area.
And so this, when they build these settlements, is this land given for free to the settlers, or do they purchase it from the Israeli government? How does that work, Nathan?
I think I'm gonna give Mohamed, who probably knows a bit more on this than I do, the chance to answer this one.
To my understanding, it's the only thing they really have to pay is their taxes. they're essentially going and taking people's homes. So they're not. So in some cases, they're not even paying for the homes that they're in. In addition to that, there are times where rich Israeli businessmen, including several who live here in America, who go out and build. They help steal land and build within the West Bank these settlements, and people buy from them. So they'd be buying from the businessmen instead of the Israeli government.
Mm. Yeah, we've seen Donald Trump's name on some of these places as well. What is that relationship like?
So surprisingly, there are a lot of people within Donald Trump's inner circle who help build these settlements over there. Some people who've been connected to settlements include his own son-in-law, Kushner, as well as the current ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. These guys have been involved with settlements for a while now. And in the case of the ambassador, is a staunch supporter of the settlements and settlers.
And what happens to the Palestinian living in the areas which Israel wants to annex? Would they acquire Israeli citizenship? Would they be forced off the land and pushed into further into Palestinian territories, as they're called?
So depending on the level. So in this current annexation plan, there is currently a debate within Israel whether or not the Palestinians whose land is annexed and included as part of Israel get citizenship, or if they would get a permit to live there. And most likely what they'll get is just a permit to live in the area, but they would be encouraged. Eventually, the plan is to encourage them to move to the areas that are under Palestinian control. So effectively, ethnically cleansing the land.
Mm-hmm. And will the annexation be one in increasing stages? It's so it will. Does it? It's sort of like a push, and you keep pushing until, and it happens very slowly. So what is perhaps, Nathan, if you could explain, does it go through the Israeli government? They have to sort of put their stamp of approval on it, or who makes these decisions that now we're going to go out and we're going to annex this part or that part of the area?
So there's two kinds of annexation that have been going on and being discussed. The first kind of annexation is de facto annexation, and that's what's going on for the past 50 years, where Israel essentially asserts control over a particular area and says, okay, we're going to be setting up civilian homes here. And then once such communities are established, such as in Hebron, and properly segregated away from the Palestinian people already living there, those areas essentially expand under the Israeli military control, and they function pretty much as if they are under the sovereignty of the Israeli government anyway. What we're seeing more recently is attempts by Israel to declare that not only are these areas under, I guess, a supposedly temporary occupation, they are actually going to be taken into what Israel considers to be its international border, which it has never properly declared on its eastern side. And what they're doing now is trying to pass through the Knesset, Israel's parliament, legislation to say these parts, some of the most major parts, are our land officially, which was trying to raise the ire of people internationally. And I can speak a bit more on the political implications of that here in the United States.
Yeah, please.
Where in the past, what we've been seeing is when American politicians and activists try to speak against the de facto annexation that's been going on, there's always a conversation about how it needs to be done for security and how people support the two-state solution, when in reality, settlements expand and maintain an oppressive status quo where Palestinians and Israelis are treated very unequally.
Can you share a little bit more about that, especially about Palestinian children versus Israeli settlers?
Yeah, sure. I was just to finish off my previous point very briefly, what we're seeing now with the taking over of land officially is the veil is coming down, where the supposed support for the two-state solution from Israel's side is gone. And now there's no way beyond actually pursuing accountability that remains for American lawmakers to actually show support for even a two-state solution or Palestinian rights more broadly. And to answer your question about the differences between how Palestinians and Israelis are treated, to illustrate just how unequal these settlements are, if you're an Israeli civilian living in the settlements, you are given the due process of law and very often let off the hook when you're inciting violence against Palestinians living there. So the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem has footage showing Israeli settlers attacking Palestinian homes or otherwise committing hate crimes against Palestinians where the military does nothing. But on the other hand, Palestinians, even children who throw stones, have been filmed by B'Tselem being detained as young as 5 years old, separated from their parents, where, according to Defense of Children International Palestine, 73% of Palestinian children experienced physical violence following their arrest. They are not given the right to legal counsel during their interrogation, and often the proceedings happen in Hebrew when the children only know Arabic. And children are not properly informed of their rights. They're separated from their families. And what you see there is a stark similarity between what happens to Palestinian children in the West Bank, immigrants and detention centers on the US border, and it's such a clear violation of basic decency to anyone that wishes to pay attention that now we're starting to see activists and lawmakers pursuing more measures of accountability on all levels in the United States.
I wanted to ask, because, and then we'll move to some of the work that is being done here in the United States. Mohamed, you know that there are several scenarios how this could, from an Israeli perspective, perhaps like their possible plans. And we realize each one of these plans are disastrous for Palestinians. But could you explain some of these plans to us, the different scenarios that could play out?
So the truth is, it all every Israeli plan leads to one path, and at the end of the day, it leads to what they've been aiming for since the initial ethnic cleansing in 1948, which is a full control of the land and being able to control all the people within it. The way it really looks now is that if they are to go through with the annexation, they would effectively turn the Palestinian areas into small Bantustans, similar to that of South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And they'd have full control over all the people and give them a symbolic country, so to speak, for them to live in, where they wouldn't be able to wander into Israeli areas and things like that. If the annexation plan does not go through today, it will still be an apartheid state because Israel controls all the land and controls the way the people move, the way that people are able to access different areas, and still occupy the West Bank and have laid siege onto Gaza. So no matter what, it doesn't really look good for the Palestinian people or the hopes of a Palestinian state, whether or not this goes through.
So right now, in regards to Jerusalem and access to Jerusalem, can we talk a little bit about that? What would this plan that they're planning right now, we had talked about, does that still give Palestinians in the West Bank access to Jerusalem?
So the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank do not have access to go to Jerusalem. Before this plan even goes through, the majority of Palestinians who live in the different areas, whether area B, C, A or B, are not allowed easy access to Jerusalem. The majority of Palestinians who do go to Jerusalem are either ones with a foreign passport, or Palestinians who have a special type of permit that Israel would grant. So it's not like Palestinians have easy access to Jerusalem. The only ones who do are the ones who are in the vicinity of Jerusalem itself. But of course, the eventual goal would be to annex Jerusalem as well into an Israeli state.
Yeah, so we definitely know that that it's not an easy access at all. But what it seems like, it's like it would be a severance, like total not being able to enter in any sort of way unless you go around this entire region, and coming in would be terribly. I don't know how that would even play out. Like even just going from one side to the other. And we have all seen footage coming out, and people who go there and visit and see how difficult it is for people to move from one, just within even just half a mile or a couple of meters from, and have checkpoints and all of that come out. This is something like I feel like a lot of people don't really realize what that means living there. And it would be, and then perhaps we're going to try to get somebody who's, and if you guys have any connections to somebody who's actually living there, for them to come and describe what it means to be living in West Bank and functioning as a society while in these different areas. But let's move back to the United States. What responsibility do people here have as they watch this from here? Like, many have called for an end to United States aid to Israel and the massive amounts of artillery and money that our country pours into Israel, especially in a time where COVID, where we're told there isn't enough to take care of people right over here. And the United States has held a firmly very pro-Israeli stance and has defended Israel in front of organizations such as the United Nations, sometimes even single-handedly when others point out human rights violations happening in Palestine. So how do you both think human rights organizations can work towards advocating for the rights of Palestinians and pressuring the United States government to reduce and end foreign aid to Israel, from both, from a Mohamed, if you could talk about it from a Muslim perspective, and Nathan, if you could talk about it from a Jewish perspective.
So definitely as Americans, whether it be through the organizations or just us as individuals, the first thing is definitely spreading the word. More people need to know what's going on. And if people don't know what's going on, they're not going to be able to stand against it. Thankfully, this annexation plan got a lot of coverage, and a lot of people have been able to go out and speak out against it. Like I said, there are many protests planned around the country, including here in DC later on today. So people are able to go out and speak out and show their support for the Palestinian people. In addition to making sure that the word gets out, people understand the crimes that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people, what's very important is supporting our legislatures who are trying to bring more attention to it, and bring more attention to the cause. And in the case of AOC, Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, and 10 other Congress people who wrote a letter to the State Department speaking about annexation and saying that if annexation is to go through, that they would take a look at the money that Israel is getting from America to make sure none of it goes towards this annexation project. America is the largest sponsor of Israeli apartheid and the largest sponsor of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, even while we are going through one of the worst pandemics in our lifetimes and one of the worst economic problems in our lifetime. Israel, while Americans are starving, 45 million Americans have lost their jobs. America is voting on sending more money to Israel, making sure that they get $38 billion. So that things like this need to be spoken about. If we can't afford to take care of our own people here in America, why are we sending money to another country that's not only committing war crimes, committing apartheid and stealing land, but is not in line with the values that America claims to uphold? We need to be able, as American citizens, to be able to stand up and urge our politicians to make sure that they're not supporting this. Our tax dollars should not be going to support crimes against humanity in other countries, whether that be in Israel or others, but specifically Israel at this moment. And if you are, I know that there are some viewers from other countries that are on with us today. If you're in Canada, the same thing goes to you. Canada is a staunch supporter of Israel, and you need to be able to call out your government when it does things like this as well.
Nathan?
All right. So to expand more on what Mohamed was saying, what I'm going to give all listeners right now is not necessarily my own perspective, but a plan of action that everybody listening right now can take. Where what I've been doing for the past couple of years now, not as anyone special, but just as a constituent, is I've been setting up meetings in the Washington, D.C. offices of Senators Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen and the representatives from Maryland to push them to co-sponsor H.R. 2407, which is a currently existing bill to withdraw U.S. aid from the military detention of Palestinian children. And going forward, what we can do in Maryland, what you can do as constituents, no matter where you are at your local offices, is setting up meetings with your local congresspeople and telling them to co-sign the letter written by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calling for full equality and pressure from the United States. You can set up meetings with congresspeople calling for them to co-sponsor the McCollum legislation against detention of children. You can give phone calls on a daily basis, really, to your legislators, telling them what you want them to do, and don't just do it. Get your friends to come in, recruit other people for these meetings, get involved in your local communities, and then just send an email to your local office and say, hey, I'd like to set up a meeting. When can we talk? Other things you can do are when big events hit the news from Israel, you can write an op-ed and send it to your local newspaper. I've done it for the Baltimore Sun. Sometimes it's easier to get it into smaller outlets. You can organize town halls for community advocacy and education, sometimes even with your local cities, such as Tacoma Park, which held a screening of The Occupation of the American Mind. You can also, if some of your legislators are especially problematic, organize protests against them in their town halls or at their offices in order to show them that you as a constituent and you as a community are not happy with inaction when it comes to holding Israel accountable for its current actions.
And Nathan, I wanted to ask you, is it easier for you as a Jewish person to walk into an office and demand that?
Sometimes it is, but not especially from my perspective, although I'm sure that Palestinians who come to meetings without someone like me can probably offer a different perspective, because it's slightly hard for me to see from my position as a white-skinned American to really say. But at the end of the day, even if you might find it hard, it's worth remembering meetings that you have with Congress are going to be private unless you choose to publicize what happens in them. And the first time you go, it's not going to necessarily be easy. The first time I went, I had a polo shirt and torn jeans, and then I started dressing more nicely. So it just takes practice. And as you start to get better, anybody is going to be able to do it. Find friends who can speak well on the topic if you feel uncomfortable. And at the end of the day, if you just keep doing it, you just get better. It becomes easier. People start to get to know you and ask you for help with doing it themselves. And that's what you can do going forward to help push the envelope on these topics.
Mohammed, have you found the conversation changing in the United States about Palestine in the past couple of years?
Yes, actually, great question. The first time I ever went and advocated, I joined a Palestine Advocacy Day hosted by the organization I work for, American Muslims for Palestine. The first time I went, I remember speaking to these congressional staff members and Senate staff members and having a much harder time than I do now. Thankfully, through the work of organizations like American Muslims for Palestine, we've been able to help change the narrative. Where a couple years ago, it was impossible to get people to talk about settlements, impossible to get them to talk about actual change in regards to our relationship with Israel, to now we have one bill in support of Palestinian rights, HR 2407, and we've had multiple letters to the State Department that talk about taking away aid to Israel, with now even former presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others who have come out and said that taking away aid is not off the table. Everything is on the table if Israel is not working with us. And now we have many people who are running for Congress who are challenging the status quo that America has with Israel. So thankfully, within the past 10 years, the conversation on Palestine has changed in this country. And we're seeing a growing amount of support on the grassroots level and in the congressional offices as well. And hopefully, as we get closer, we'll be able to get more change and more support from these congressional offices and from the government as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And Nathan, has the conversation changed in Jewish circles?
I think that's definitely a very big generational shift that's been happening in our community. While there have been people who are active in my parents' generation and in my grandparents' generation, what we're really seeing is the rise of organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, especially among younger activists who are getting more involved and seeing the increased exposure of Palestinian voices across the country. Mm-hmm. And so there's a Jewish community that I'm a part of. It's called Hinenu, which means I am here. It's the Baltimore Justice Stiebel, which is kind of like a small synagogue. Mm-hmm. And we are here to dedicate ourselves as a Jewish community to solidarity with other local organizations. So we'll engage in protests with local Black Lives Matter and immigrants' rights organizations against ICE. We, in our charter statement, have made very clear that while it's a Jewish community, all people are welcome to come, to make friends, to eat, to organize, whether they are LGBT, straight, whether they're Jewish, Palestinian, Black, white, or any other demographic under the sun. And what we're seeing is organizations like Hinenu becoming increasingly prominent in the fold of mainstream Jewish advocacy, and groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, one of the worst pro-Israel lobbies in the country, have been taking notice. And they're scared of people like us because they can no longer claim that they are our community, because we've got dissent against some of the more entrenched organizations like theirs.
Hmm. So that's something interesting with AIPAC. I wanted to ask you, do both of you have Canary Mission profiles? I think Nathan does. But what is Canary Mission?
I'll just say briefly, it's a website dedicated to blacklisting college students who support Palestine, but anybody with a head on their shoulders knows that it's just a far-right website dedicated to inciting against Arab and Palestinian students. I have a profile because they want to call me, I guess,